What really happens when you leave everything to God? There comes a moment when holding everything together starts to feel heavier than letting it go. You've planned, adjusted, prayed, and tried again. You've carried responsibility with good intentions, believing that if you stayed vigilant enough, faithful enough, careful enough, things would finally settle. But instead of peace, you found fatigue. Instead of clarity, you found pressure. And somewhere along the way, the question quietly surfaced: what would happen if you stopped managing everything and trusted God with all of it? Leaving everything to God sounds simple when spoken, but deeply unsettling when lived. It feels like standing at the edge of something unseen, knowing that stepping forward means surrendering the comfort of control. The Bible never pretends that this kind of surrender is easy. In fact, Scripture often shows that the greatest acts of faith begin where certainty ends. God does not ask for partial trust. He asks for the kind that releases outcomes, timing, and understanding into His hands. What makes this moment so difficult is not that you don't believe in God, but that you've learned how to survive by holding on. You've been responsible. You've been cautious. You've done what you could to protect what matters. And yet, God gently invites you to a deeper place, not where effort disappears, but where reliance shifts. A place where trust becomes the foundation instead of effort. When you begin leaving everything to God, something unexpected happens. The struggle doesn't always disappear immediately. In fact, some emotions intensify before they quiet. Fear surfaces. Anxiety speaks louder. Old habits of control resist release. But this is not failure. This is exposure. God allows what has been hidden to come to the surface so it can finally be surrendered. The Bible shows us that surrender is not losing direction. It is changing who leads. It is learning to walk without demanding to see the entire path. It is choosing to trust God's character when you don't yet understand His methods. And while the world equates surrender with weakness, Scripture reveals it as strength shaped by faith. If you're standing in that space right now, tired of carrying everything, unsure of what letting go truly means, this message is for you. Not to rush you into surrender, but to show you what begins to unfold when trust replaces control. Because leaving everything to God does not mean your life becomes smaller. It often means it finally becomes steady. Number one, your illusion of control begins to break down. One of the first and most unsettling things that happens when you leave everything to God is that the illusion of control you've lived under for so long begins to weaken. For years, control may have felt like responsibility. You planned carefully, you stayed alert, you prepared for every outcome you could imagine. And in doing so, you told yourself you were being wise, faithful, and diligent. But beneath that effort was something quieter and heavier. The belief that if you loosened your grip, everything would fall apart. When you truly place everything in God's hands, that belief is exposed. Plans stop responding the way they used to. Strategies that once brought reassurance no longer calm your heart. You realize how much of your peace depended on predictability rather than trust. And this realization can feel frightening, not freeing, at least at first. The Bible shows us that God often allows what we depend on to fail before He reveals what He provides. Not to embarrass us, but to release us. As long as you believe you are the one holding everything together, surrender remains theoretical. God gently dismantles false security so that real faith can take root. This breakdown can feel personal. You may wonder why things feel harder now that you're trying to trust God. You may question whether surrender was premature or whether you misunderstood His call. But what's happening is not collapse. It's exposure. God is revealing the difference between responsibility and ownership. Responsibility asks you to act faithfully with what's in front of you. Ownership demands outcomes and guarantees. God never asked you to carry guarantees. If your life feels less manageable since you chose to trust God more deeply, don't rush to reclaim control. This discomfort is often the first evidence that surrender is genuine. God is removing the weight you were never meant to carry so you can learn what it means to be held instead. What feels like instability is often the beginning of freedom. Freedom rooted not in control, but in trust. Number 2. Anxiety surfaces before peace arrives. Another unexpected part of leaving everything to God is that anxiety often surfaces before peace settles in. Many people assume that surrender should immediately bring relief, but the Bible reveals a more honest process. When you stop managing outcomes, the fears that were hidden beneath activity and control finally rise to the surface. Surrender doesn't create anxiety, it uncovers it. Control has a way of keeping fear occupied. It gives your mind tasks, plans, and contingencies to focus on, so you don't have to sit with uncertainty. When you release control, those distractions fall away, and you're left face to face with what you've been avoiding. The fear of loss, the fear of waiting, the fear that things might not turn out the way you hoped. God does not rush to silence this anxiety, because He wants to heal it, not mask it. Scripture shows us that peace is not the absence of uncertainty. It is the presence of trust. And trust cannot form where fear is denied. God allows anxiety to surface so it can finally be surrendered honestly. This is why surrender can feel worse before it feels better. Your soul is learning a new posture. Instead of bracing for impact, it's learning how to rest. Instead of controlling, it's learning how to depend. That transition is uncomfortable because it challenges habits that once felt necessary for survival. If anxiety has increased since you began releasing control, don't retreat. This is not failure. It is part of the cleansing process. God is gently removing what you relied on instead of Him and replacing it with something deeper. Peace will come, but it will come as the fruit of trust, not as a shortcut around fear. The Bible reminds us that God guards hearts, not schedules. And when peace finally arrives, it is steadier than anything control ever produced. It does not depend on outcomes being resolved. It rests in knowing that even in uncertainty, God is present, faithful, and fully capable of carrying what you've released. Number 3. God begins redirecting your life in ways you didn't ask for. When you leave everything to God, direction rarely arrives as clarity. More often it arrives as redirection, and not the kind you requested. Paths you were confident about begin to stall. Plans you invested time, prayer, and hope into start losing momentum. Doors you assumed would open remain closed, sometimes without explanation. And this can feel deeply unsettling, especially when you've already surrendered control. The Bible shows us that God rarely explains His redirections in advance. He leads by movement, not by map. Abraham was told to go without knowing where. Israel followed a cloud, without knowing the destination. God often asks for obedience before understanding, not because He is withholding information, but because trust grows when control is no longer the guide. Redirection is difficult because it interrupts momentum. You may feel like surrender has slowed your life down instead of moving it forward. You may question whether you misunderstood God, whether you let go too soon, or whether trusting Him has complicated things unnecessarily. But Scripture reveals a consistent pattern. God redirects not because you are wrong, but because He sees what you cannot. Often God closes doors to protect you from paths that look promising, but would eventually drain, distract, or retort your purpose. What feels like delay may actually be rescue. What looks like loss may be alignment. God's redirection is rarely about punishment. It is about precision. If your life feels less predictable since you surrendered, don't rush to regain control. That uncertainty is not abandonment. It is guidance without explanation. God redirects those who trust Him, because surrender gives Him permission to lead more deeply. And while the new direction may not make sense now, it will eventually reveal why the old one needed to close. Number 4, your identity slowly separates from outcomes and performance. One of the most profound changes that happens when you leave everything to God is not something others can see. It is something you feel. Over time, your identity begins to detach from outcomes. Success no longer defines you the way it once did. Failure no longer devastates you in the same way. Your worth becomes quieter, steadier, and less reactive. Before surrender, it's easy to measure your value through results. Progress reassures you. Productivity stabilizes you. When things move forward, you feel confident. When they stall, anxiety creeps in. But the Bible never measures worth by outcomes. It measures faithfulness. And when you release outcomes to God, He begins rerouting your identity in relationship, not performance. This shift can feel uncomfortable at first, without results to lean on. You may feel exposed. You may wonder who you are when progress slows or plans change. God allows this tension because it reveals how much pressure you were carrying to prove yourself, pressure you were never meant to bear. As identity detaches from performance, peace grows. You stop chasing validation through achievement. You stop fearing failure as a verdict on your worth. God is teaching you to see yourself the way He does, not as a project to perfect, but as a child to lead. If you've noticed that outcomes no longer define your sense of value the way they once did, this is not loss of ambition. It is maturity of faith. God is stabilizing your identity so no success can inflate it and no setback can destroy it. When identity is no longer tied to results, surrender becomes sustainable, and peace becomes possible even when nothing is resolved yet. Number 5. You experience a new kind of strength, one you didn't produce. As surrender deepens, something unexpected begins to replace the effort you've released. It doesn't feel like confidence, excitement, or motivation. It feels quieter than that, steadier. You find yourself continuing without the urgency that once drove you, enduring without forcing, standing without pushing yourself forward. This strength doesn't rush, it holds. Before surrender, strength often came from adrenaline and control. You pushed because you had to. You stayed alert because you believed everything depended on you. But when you leave everything to God, that source of strength slowly dries up, and something else takes its place. The Bible describes this as strength that is perfected in weakness. Not because weakness is ideal, but because it creates space for God to sustain rather than you striving to survive. This new strength often shows up in subtle ways. You face the day without the familiar knot of dread. You respond thoughtfully instead of reacting emotionally. You keep going even when progress is slow and motivation is low. God is teaching you how to rely on grace daily, not just during breakthroughs. What makes this strength different is that it doesn't depend on clarity. You may still have unanswered questions. Circumstances may still feel unresolved, but you are no longer collapsing under the weight of not knowing. Scripture reminds us that God's strength does not eliminate struggle, it carries you through it. If you've noticed that you are still standing, even though you no longer feel driven by fear or pressure, don't overlook that. That endurance is not coming from you. It is evidence that surrender has changed the source of your strength. God is holding what you released, and in return, He is giving you the ability to endure without striving. Number 6, relationships and attachments begin to shift without force. Another thing that begins to happen when you leave everything to God is that relationships start to change, sometimes quietly, sometimes painfully, often without explanation. People you once leaned on heavily may drift. Certain attachments loosen. Priorities rearrange themselves without announcement. And while this can feel like loss, it is often alignment. When control is released, dependency is revealed. God begins showing you where you relied on people, approval or familiarity in ways that quietly competed with trust in Him. This is not condemnation. It is correction, rooted in care. God does not remove relationships carelessly. He reshapes them purposefully. The Bible shows us that God often prunes connections, not because people are bad, but because attachments have become too heavy. You may realize that you were clinging out of fear, loyalty, or the need for stability, rather than love. Surrender teaches you to love without gripping, to care without controlling, and to trust God more than proximity. These shifts can feel lonely at first. You may grieve connections that once felt essential, but over time you begin to notice something else: space to breathe, space to hear God more clearly, space to become who He is forming you to be. If you've noticed relationships changing since you surrendered control, don't rush to restore what God may be reshaping. Distance is not always rejection. Sometimes it is recalibration. God is teaching you how to walk with Him as your primary source so that every other relationship can take its proper place. When attachments shift without force, it is often because surrender has reordered your life. God is not taking love away from you. He is teaching you how to love without fear of loss. Number 7. You learn to rest even when nothing is resolved. One of the clearest signs that you have truly left everything to God is not that your life suddenly makes sense, but that you learn how to rest, even when it doesn't. Questions may remain unanswered. Outcomes may still be uncertain. Circumstances may not have changed at all, and yet, something within you has shifted. The constant pressure to fix, predict, or control begins to loosen its grip. This kind of rest is not passive. It is not resignation. It is a deep internal agreement that God is trustworthy, even when clarity is delayed. The Bible shows us again and again that rest is an act of faith. God invites His people to rest not because everything is finished, but because He is faithful. Before surrender, rest felt impossible without resolution. You waited for certainty before allowing your heart to settle. But now, rest arrives first. Not because you understand what God is doing, but because you trust who He is. This is a profound change. It means faith has moved from theory to posture. You may still care deeply. You may still hope, but the frantic edge is gone. You no longer feel the need to force outcomes or rehearse worst-case scenarios. God is teaching you how to live without carrying tomorrow on your shoulders. Scripture reminds us that God gives rest to those who trust Him, not those who have everything figured out. This rest protects your heart from exhaustion and preserves your faith during seasons of waiting. It allows you to remain present instead of consumed by what hasn't happened yet. If you've noticed that you can pause without panic, wait without despair, and trust without explanation, don't underestimate what has changed. This rest is not weakness, it is evidence of surrender taking root. God has become your anchor, not your contingency plan. And that kind of rest only comes when everything has truly been placed in His hands. Conclusion: when you leave everything to God, you are not losing, you are being held. Leaving everything to God is not a single decision. It is a gradual release, made again and again, often in moments when fear would rather take control. The Bible never presents surrender as easy, but it consistently presents it as safe. God does not ask you to let go so that you will fall. He asks you to let go so that He can hold you. Along the way, things may feel less certain before they feel secure. Control may break down before trust takes its place. Anxiety may surface before peace settles in. Direction may feel unclear before it becomes precise. Relationships may shift. Strength may change its source, but none of this is loss. It is transition. When you leave everything to God, you are not abandoning responsibility. You are releasing ownership. You are allowing God to lead where you once insisted on managing. And in that exchange, something steadier forms. Not a life without difficulty, but a life that is no longer ruled by fear. Surrender does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop carrying what was never meant to be yours. It means trusting God's character when you cannot trace His hand. It means believing that even in silence, God is present and working. If you are in the process of letting go, be patient with yourself. God is not rushing you. Surrender grows through trust, not pressure. And every time you choose to release control again, you are not moving backward. You are moving deeper. If this message met you where you are, take a moment to reflect on what you may still be holding too tightly. Release it gently. God does not demand perfection. He honors willingness. And if you want more messages that speak honestly about faith, surrender, and walking with God through uncertainty, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Leaving everything to God does not make your life smaller. It makes it steadier.